Okay, so cohort B, here's where we ended on Friday, and look at this. There's only 2 slides left. So we even kind of glanced at this one. So I'll just hit these as a quick review, and then we'll jump into part 2, chapter 7, with a little bit of tech time at the beginning. A couple things going on. So remember we talked about this rebellion, Shays Rebellion. Daniel Shays leads a group of farmers basically in an uprising, and this, among other things, but this really illustrates the weakness of the Articles of Confederation, where the government really couldn't do anything, and so they have to call on the colonial Massachusetts regiment that fought in the Revolutionary War to put this down. So you can see this idea of Congress being the only branch of government under the Articles, looking at the fact that, my God, we're already falling apart. So it really motivated. There was two, you can't call them constitutional conventions. There was one that preceded the actual constitutional convention, and that's in a video that I use in the next set. But then, of course, they meet again and come up with the Constitution that we know today, based on the weaknesses they saw in the Articles, and there were plenty of them. And so, finishing up that last slide, and I'm leaving it out of slideshow mode just because we're going to jump out of this. The Northwest Ordinances, there's a series of laws that deal with this new section of the country that's come in. Again, the territory gained through the French and Indian War, but after the Revolution now, we have new potential states coming in. And so this one, I don't know if it's key. There's 2 pieces that are important, and we mentioned this. It's a template. It says that you can come in, and here's how you do it, and you're going to come in at the same level of the original 13 states. So it's a way for new states to petition and then enter the Union. And they enter at the same level as the original colony/states. The other piece, in the fill in the blank, and we did this in class, but it was toward the end, all the territories associated with the Northwest Ordinances will now be free states, no slavery allowed. And that's going to set kind of a tone or a precedence as we move forward. In the Constitutional Convention, yes, but beyond that, as we move toward disunion and civil war, there's a power struggle going on between slave states and free states. And right here, in one fell swoop, we put in effectively 6. Minnesota looks a lot different once we get across the Mississippi River, but the potential for 6 free states, which can upset the balance of power in the Congress. Right? And the last piece of this rectangular survey, it's just kind of, if you ever go to the Midwest, it's like the town square, they're designed in this kind of rectangular fashion, and that's why. So enough on that. That finishes up. That's all we didn't cover. Not bad, huh? Okay, tech time. First thing, I sent this out as an email, and it's in the announcements. Because of the way the class works, you know, I went back and forth on the chapters, but as we're getting toward the midterm in the middle of this course, 2111, it struck me as the original syllabus just didn't really fit the bill. So what I'm going to do is for both cohorts. Right now, I'm finishing chapter 7, part 2 video for you guys. And then the cohort A folks will get it in class, and then we're going to do this presentation and writing workshop, just talking about how to, do citations, references, how to put together a basic PowerPoint presentation. And then the second half of that class will be team time. So we'll decide on which presentations, teams of 2, 3, 4, somewhere in there, which topic you want to pick. And then with you guys, we'll do all of chapter 8, and cohort A will get this in video form. It's a fairly short chapter, and that concludes all of the material we're going to need to take the midterm. And so it says up here in the notes, but the midterm's over chapters 1 through 8. All the stuff we've covered thus far, nothing beyond that. The final will cover the whole text, obviously. So that means when we come in, yes, Thursday we'll do chapter 8. Friday will be that presentation writing workshop that cohort A got. And at the same time as we finish chapter 8, the midterm which will be online, will be open. And then we'll fall into a part 1, part 2, and by class 18, we're back into the syllabus flow as printed in the, or up here in lessons. Okay, so that gives both cohorts a chance to do this and some team time, so you guys will get that as well. Get your team, pick a topic, start working on it, right? We're in the computer lab or on your Chromebooks, either one, and I'll be there to help. It's not like just throw you in the pond and hope you swim. Another piece of tech time, and this is a link, but I'll show you what it looks like because we're going to jump to it. It's a searchable constitution, right? You see me carry mine around in my backpack, but it shows the preamble, the articles that ascribe duties, what they can and can't do for the legislative, executive, and judicial branches, excuse me, and then the amendments. So we're going to be using this some today. We'll jump back and forth, but that link is in here, and it's a good place to find information if you need it, all right? And then the last one, I'll just show you what it looks like. Again, there's a link to the Citizens Against Government Waste that has to do with legislation where congressmen and congresswomen stick in pieces to a bill like the Defense Authorization Act that says here's how we're going to pay the military, and that always passes. So what they do is they'll stick in little lines in that bill that affect their constituents, where they're from, and oftentimes they have nothing to do with the bill itself. It's a way to get money for their district. And so these folks, Citizens Against Government Waste, actually keep track of this, and you'd be amazed some of the stupid stuff that gets plugged into bills because they know it's going to pass. And so we'll probably take a look at this in class because it translates better in person, to look up the, they don't call it the hog log, but it's basically the biggest offenders on what's called pork barrel politics. Okay, so there's your tech time. Let's jump into the actual part we're going to cover. So we just cleaned up the few dogs and cats. Let's move forward into Chapter 7, Part 2. And this is really getting into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of the Constitution, how it came to be, and some of the specifics. Is it real exciting? It's not going to, you know, there's not a Netflix movie about it. But if you want to know how the country works and doesn't work, it's good to know this, because a lot of people quote the Constitution, they have no idea what they're talking about. So, a couple more concepts to discuss. Now that we have the country founded, the Articles failed, rewriting this new Constitution, there's two groups at play. And these are all part of the Founding Fathers. Federalists, Anti-Federalists. Federalists, if you think about Federalists as federal government, the fill in the blank part is they wanted a strong, a powerful central government. Now, not nearly as strong as a monarchy, but still more power in the central government. And part of that comes from the failings of the Articles. Whereas the Anti-Federalists were still more in that confederation idea. Remember, that's a looser affiliation of states, with states having primary power. And again, even when the Constitution starts, the states are more powerful than the central government. But you can see there's a difference of opinion here as to how much power should be at the federal level. And that stress actually helps develop the Bill of Rights, believe it or not, because the Anti-Federalists were afraid of too much centralized power. So we'll get to that. Which of these groups, it doesn't automatically pop to mind, but which group would demand a Bill of Rights? The answer is the Anti-Federalists, because those Bill of Rights help limit the power of a too strong federal government. Here's some of the rights citizens will have. And so what they do is the Anti-Federalists, we're not going to sign this Constitution, we're not going to ratify it until we know there's going to be some limitations on government, i.e. the Bill of Rights. And so the Constitution, 1787, actually does get approved with the promise that they do fulfill of a Bill of Rights, which comes out in 1791. So it's a couple years, but still the promise of doing it and the trust in their fellow politicians, governors, statesmen, allowed the Anti-Federalists to go ahead and sign. Because when we get to it, right, we have 13 original states. None of that Northwest territory has yet become, none of them have applied for statehood yet. So if I need 3/4 of the states to approve the Constitution, that means I need 9 of 13. And with the difference, especially north to south, in what's being grown and how they were founded, that's not an easy task. And with anti-federalists saying we're not going to sign it, that would have made the task impossible. So that's why the Bill of Rights was such a big piece of this. It helped quell the fears of the anti-federalists. Is it a prelude to political parties? Partially. Because the country's founded, there's no really dedicated political parties. They were called the Federalists, but it had to do with this idea of government. But very quickly after the founding, George Washington, John Adams, Federalist, but the Federalist Party sort of dissolves, and we see the rise of the Democratic Republicans under Jefferson. And so that's the beginning of, and then we're going to see the Whig Party, and the Democratic Republicans become just the Democrats, and the rise of the Republican Party. So it does kind of prelude that division between how the country should be run in their minds, right? Nothing in the Constitution says a word about political parties, and in fact, George Washington in his farewell address warned of polarization in political parties, and boy was he right. He also said avoid foreign entanglements, right? And so we mentioned this in passing, but some of those ideas, the Locke, the Hobbes, the John Stuart Mill, reason is plugged into our Constitution and constitutional government. So the founders were extremely smart. Most of them very wealthy, but what was it, like 0.1% of the people had a college degree at this point, and almost all of them did. Okay, so heads in the way. There's the link to that Constitution I showed you, online and searchable. And so some of the ideas in it, there's certain grants, a grant being yes, you can do this, and denials, no, you can't do this. So they're specific about it, but think about it. I mean, they can't write every law, and they can't think so far into the future that they could cover every eventuality. So that's why there's an allowance to amend as well. So here's what you can do. Specific powers, grants of, and let's, instead of just blah, blah, let's look at them. There's 17. Article 1, let me click through this, and then we'll jump to the Constitution itself. And the denials, you cannot, prohibitions on, you cannot do that. And they made the Constitution difficult to amend on purpose, so that we didn't have 600 amendments, right, that it was so easy to do it. So that's why we only have 27 in 250 plus years, right? Or less than that, I guess. I can't do math. And just to geek out a little bit, if you hear about Article 1, that's talking about legislative. Article 2 is the executive, and Article 3 is the judicial branch. So Article 1, Section 8 is about Congress, right, the legislative branch. So let's look at that just quickly. That's why I had this pulled up. The amendments come last. First part, and we'll come back to this, the preamble, the Schoolhouse Rock thing. This is America's thesis statement, why we're doing the rest of this, for these reasons. Article 1, Section 8. Here's what Congress can do. And I've asked you guys before, who declares war? Well, it's Congress, and it's written in here. Who controls the budget? Congress, and it's written in here. Now, there's some blending on the edges. There's some checks and balances on it. Post offices, Congress, right? They have quite a list. And then this, what's called the elastic clause, to make all laws which should be necessary and proper. That's kind of a catch-all, that we don't know for sure what's coming, so you guys have a lot of latitude there, right? And then there are some prohibitions of what you can't do. Like this, the writ of habeas corpus, being told what you're being thrown in jail for cannot be suspended. Unless, and there's almost always a caveat, and guess who used that? Abraham Lincoln. Right? So you can see here's some of the prohibitions, things you can't do. So it's spelled out very clearly. Now, does Congress do this? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So there's your link, and it may be useful if you're looking something up to write about or for your presentation, which we'll talk about in class. So other powers, what if they're not specifically allowed or disallowed, because again, just think how big the Constitution would be if they tried to cover every eventuality. It would be impossible. So in the Bill of Rights, there's kind of a catch-all, and you saw even in Article 1, what was it, Section 9, or the end of Section 8 rather, the elastic clause, that you have some latitude to use your own judgment. Okay, and so if you look at the Bill of Rights, Amendments 9 and 10, they talk about if it's not covered, here's what to do about it. And, you know, think about some of these modern concepts. With you guys, we talked about the idea of abortion, birth control, etc. There's no way the founders could have thought into the future, legalizing drugs, right? Go back to the 1920s, cocaine was legal. It was in toothache medicine. And so, again, I should have stayed here. Let's go back and look just at those specifically. And then I've got a summation, because I think it's nice to know what the Bill of Rights says, but it condenses it so you understand what it's talking about. Ninth Amendment, the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. So basically it's saying if we don't cover it, then maybe a law will have to be written to cover it, but it doesn't mean you can't do it. Right? It's more about writing what you can do. And then the 10th Amendment, powers not delegated in the Constitution nor prohibited. Right? We'll go to the states, and if not the states, then to the people. So that's how we work. We still have a federal, state, local government. People can go forward and do a find signatures, do a referendum, put something on the ballot to vote into law. So those are kind of catch-alls, because they knew, again, that they couldn't cover every eventuality. So pretty smart guys, right? And I think that's last time. We'll go back to that at least. Okay, some videos. And again, I'd play them, but I'd get a copyright infringement of some kind. So the first one, I don't know, this was big when I was a kid, but a lot of people still know it. This is talking about the Constitution. It makes a little song about the preamble. And it makes it easy to remember what the basic thesis of the government is. The second one is John Green's Crash Course History. The whole thing's good. It's talking about the articles and the Constitution, how it comes to be. But starting at about 4 minutes, 24 seconds or so, he covers some of the compromises that had to occur. Because again, remember, we got to get 9 of 13 states to agree on this. And there's a lot of contentious issues in there. Big state, small state, the issue of slavery, the issue of federalist, anti-federalist, big or small government. So they had to work these out to get enough of the states to sign on to it, right? And so watch through it, the big compromises. And in class we would, so instead I just listed them down here. So the first one, and probably the biggest, it becomes known as the Great Compromise. The Virginia versus the New Jersey plan. Madison, Virginia, Hamilton was into this too. They wanted to have representation based on the size of the state. Size being population, not necessarily geographic size. Okay, great. But the smaller states, like New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, feared that the big states would just roll over them because they would have the most votes. So the kind of arguing back and forth, they came up with this bicameral, it's called, but a two-house Congress. Right? The Senate represents 2 per every state, so we have a balance, big state, small state, all the same. Whereas the House is based on the population, roughly. It's not an exact equation, but the bigger the state, population-wise, the more representatives they have. That's why California has 53 in the House, because it's the biggest state by population. You look at Texas, Florida, big numbers, right? Georgia has 14. It's kind of a medium state. Tennessee, 9. And then some only have 1, like Wyoming, because the population is so small. So every state, 2 senators voted in and elected for 6-year terms. And then every state, based on population, the House, re-elected every 2 years. And you'll see, just another piece of trivia maybe, this last time, right, Georgia had 2 senators up. That was unusual because someone had resigned, so they plugged Loeffler in for a little while. but generally 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election at any one time. So every 2 years, you're going to have a third of the Senate, third of the Senate, third of the Senate, right? Because they're elected for 6-year terms. So the second was, and we've already talked about this a little bit, the Federalist, non-Federalist, stronger central government, not in the realm of a monarchy, and then weaker central government, more states' rights, more akin to, or at least closer to the Articles of Confederation. And then a compromise on slavery, and this is a difficult one. If you remember that kind of time-lapsed map that we looked at, we see that slavery is ubiquitous in the colonies, but over time, and 1790, now that we actually have states, you saw the decline of slavery in the Northeast and the New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, that area, and the migration south because of the crops being grown, tobacco and cotton being two of those enumerated articles. And so slavery growing in the South and becoming more and more important for the Southern economy. So to compromise on that, can we just say we're going to eliminate it? No, because that's going to make the Southern states mad. Can we say it's everywhere? No, because the Northern states had already gotten rid of it, and there's an abolitionist idea growing. And so we got to come up with something kind of in the middle. And so what they do is, one, throw a bone to the Southern states by saying we're going to count your slaves partially toward your number of representatives. So it's called the 3/5 clause, right? 3/5 of all the slaves in a given state are counted toward the overall population, which leads to more representatives in the House based on slavery. And they also throw in a fugitive slave clause. Because they're property, you have the right to bring your property back if it runs away, right? And that's, we talked about chattel slavery and how despicable the institution is. But if you consider that as human property machinery, if they run away, you have the right to go get them. So the South makes them happier, right? But what are we doing for those against the institution? Well, the idea was 20 years after we sign this document, bam, we're going to shut off the spigot, so no more of that slave trade that we looked at, the ships in that middle passage coming across the Atlantic. So that's kind of the bone thrown to the northern states. But what that does is it sets sort of a time bomb in the Constitution that's going to go off in 1860, right? So those are the three big compromises baked in that had to be solved, and they are, to get the Constitution ratified. And so, cut to the chase. Did they get 9 of 13? Of course. In fact, they get 11 of the 13. And then it was North Carolina and I want to say Rhode Island were the last two holdouts, which didn't matter because 11 of 13 says thumbs up, it's good. We ratified for everybody. And they eventually came around and said, okay, we'll join the party, because it was a moot point by then. So here you go, the preamble, the Constitution, the opening thesis statement for America. And I throw this up here, and it had, if we were in class, I'd have you guys try to fill in the blanks, and that's where that Schoolhouse Rock kind of comes in. But let's look at what the thesis statement says. First three words say who the government is. We the people. This goes all the way back to the Mayflower Compact, the idea that we're all in this together, and the power derived comes from the people being governed. Now throw on top of that Hobbes and Locke idea of a social contract between the government and the people. Governments protect their people in numerous ways. We were talking about it in class, right? USDA protecting our food so you don't get poisoned, things like that. And in turn, we can't do absolutely anything we want. And if we do, then there's consequences, right? Who was it? Hannah brought up the idea that murder's illegal. Does that mean you can't do it? Well, you shouldn't, but if you do, there's repercussions. So we the people, and what are we doing? We're trying to make this a more perfect union. So the founders knew that, hey man, this isn't a perfect piece of work, but it's not bad. And we'll see a quote from Ben Franklin on that. And what are we going to do? Justice. Liberty and justice for all, right? The idea of freedom, but justice under the law. That it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, you get equal representation. Where does that come from? Remember the Sugar and Stamp Acts and the Vice Admiralty courts. They didn't get a trial by jury. Made them mad. Domestic tranquility, peace at home, right? Common defense, that's a pretty easy one to understand. The country is going to defend itself. The general welfare, making things better for folks. A rising tide raises all boats, not just for a certain group of people. There it is. Justice, liberty. Two key words, blessings of liberty. Freedom for ourselves and freedom from an overly oppressive government. For us, the signers of, and the people that come after us. Pretty good, huh? Short and sweet, but it defines the left and right limits of what the government can do, because it all should support these ideas, and if it doesn't, then it shouldn't be a law or in the Constitution. So here's Franklin's thought on the whole thing. You know, there's parts he didn't approve of, but that's the idea of compromise. These guys are hammering this out over the course of months and months, and some of them didn't get their way, or there was this big state, small state, or the issue of slavery, so they came to a compromise. But Franklin says, look, this is the best we can do. I expect no better, and I'm not sure that it's not the best. What's the caveat? If it doesn't work, what can they do? They put in the provision for amendments as well. So this isn't written in concrete. Things can be changed. So I think that sums it up pretty well by all the founders' thoughts on the Constitution. This is about as good as we're going to get. And if we need to fix it, we can. All right, again, better in class, but let's go through this, and John Green's video does this pretty well as well. The three branches, and the arrows in between is the idea of checks and balances, that no one branch should or can be overly powerful. And again, if you think about LEJ, legislative, executive, judicial, Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the Constitution. And so legislative, who's the big muckety mucks? It's the Congress, right? The Senate and the House. And so they're the lawmakers, so-called. Writing these different bills, each house will put together a bill on a given, what we want to do, what law do we need to put in place. The coronavirus piece right now is being kicked around. They'll work on them individually, and then they'll come together in committee and work together to try to come up with a compromise bill that's good enough. It's pieces of both the House and the Senate's bills put together. Some pieces get added from each, some get thrown out from each. Then both sides say, theoretically, good. That's good enough. Send it to the president. And so the legislative sends it over to the prez, and what can he do? He can sign it. He signs it, it becomes law. He can veto it, which means nope. And then if he does, it goes back to the Congress. And now they have the opportunity to either say, okay, he doesn't like it, they can try to rewrite it, but that doesn't work as often as potentially they can override it. So they get 2/3 of each house, the House and the Senate, to say, yep, this is good, and the president's wrong, he shouldn't have vetoed this. They can override it, and thus it becomes law. So that's your idea, check and balance. The judicial side, some of that is, we talked about this a little bit in class, to nominate both cabinet members and Supreme Court justices are approved. The president will nominate them, right? The cabinet works for the president. The Supreme Court, the president will nominate a candidate, a judge, and then the Congress, specifically the Senate, will get to vote on, yep, nope, do we want them? So far, President Biden's cabinet's been approved pretty unanimously. There's a couple that might be sticky in the future, and I'll show you a list of Supreme Court justices and who nominated them. But again, President Trump had an opportunity that very few presidents have. He was able to nominate in one term, 4 years, 3 Supreme Court justices. Sometimes it just happens that way. Somebody will retire, or like Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So all of this is baked into the Constitution as well, that no one branch can run amok because the other ones have some say and some control over it. Simple as that. And what that does, not to get too long-winded, but it makes the government work a little slower, right? It throws a little bit of sand in the gears so that one, not one branch can take over, and two, we don't rush to judgment on things. And so the founders were aware of that. Yeah, they wanted the ability to amend, but we don't want to have 600 amendments because we rush to this next great idea. And that's another piece of the balance of power. Amendments have to be approved by the states. That goes back to anti-federalism, doesn't it? Because we don't want the government just deciding, here's an amendment, bam, it's in there. The states have a play in approving amendments. Probably why we only have 27. So here's our kind of current, sort of. I went, to a little bit older list, back to the tail end of the Obama administration, and went through and put in the different Supreme Court justices and who they were nominated by, and the blue and the red, Democrat, Republican. Remember, the Supreme Court is supposed to be apolitical, right? But based on who nominates them, which president nominates them, they tend to lean either conservative or liberal based on that president. So yes, they're supposed to look at things objectively, and overall I think they do, but there is a hint of bias perhaps based on who nominates them. So I mean, it's just the way it is. People are either conservative or liberal. I don't know if anybody's just smack in the middle. So the Chief Justice, I don't have him pictured here, but he was put in by George W. Bush. Clarence Thomas, one of the oldest serving ones, H.W. Bush, right? W's dad. Justice Kennedy resigned, or retired, I should say. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, you may remember this, she just passed away not all that long ago, so that opens up a seat. Breyers, Clinton, Alito W. Bush. Obama had two, Sotomayor and Eileen Kagan, two women. Sotomayor is a Hispanic woman. Justice Scalia died. He was put in by Reagan, and he passed away while Obama was still president. Almost a year left in the presidency. It was like right around Christmas time, so the election's in November, 11 months, right? And so theoretically, President Obama, and he did put forth a nomination, Merrick Garland, but the Republicans controlling the Senate just refused to even hear an argument for nomination. So they slow rolled this to the point they were hoping, and it worked out, that a Republican would win the presidency. So that opens up, that's where Neil Gorsuch comes from. This probably should have been a Obama nomination, and it would have been Merrick Garland, who's now going to become the Attorney General, by the way. And then the last couple, Brett Kavanaugh, very contentious, right? And then Amy Coney Barrett. And this, to me, is hypocritical, and I'm not being anti-Republican here, but they slow-rolled the replacement of Scalia for almost a year and then plugged in Barrett in about a week before the election. So to me, if it's fair for one side, it's fair for the other. So be objective, but of course that's not the case. But if you look at the overall makeup of the Supreme Court, we said in class 9's a good number because that way you don't have a split decision, 4 and 4. Usually you're going to get 5 and 4, 6 and 3, some majority, some minority opinion. But you can see the overall tenor of the Supreme Court is more conservative right now. That'll change. All right, Clarence Thomas won't last forever. Some of these nominees may retire. Who knows? One of the checks and balances, Supreme Court justices can be impeached. Now they'd have to do something like take a bribe in a case, but they can be removed as well as part of checks and balances. So that's our current SCOTUS, right? The Supreme Court of the United States. Yeah, Bill of Rights. Remember I said this comes later. There's a 4-year period where they're hashing it out. Nothing happens really fast, but as promised to satisfy the anti-federalists, the Bill of Rights comes out. And so let's just step through these, right? The freedoms that we have. The First Amendment is powerful. It captures a lot. And the idea of religion, that's fair. But remember what it really says. Will not establish nor prohibit. So we're not going to have a church of the United States, and you can worship a head of lettuce if you want. Freedom of speech, but not everything's protected, right? Slander, obscenity, speech against the public interest, fire in a crowded theater, let's storm the Capitol, perhaps. Press, assembly, and petition. This idea that if you don't like something, you can petition your government to change it. And we see that with referendums, right? So that captures a lot. Oops. Right to bear arms. This one gets oversimplified as well. Read the whole thing. In fact, let's do it. A well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of the state. Right? That's off the top of my head. Let's see if I got it right. Look at that. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Now that makes sense, especially when you think about how the Revolutionary War was fought. It was citizen soldiers with their own weapons being called up at that minute to fight, right? Minutemen. So we oversimplify it too often with just that piece. There's a reason behind it. And that could lead to a more robust discussion on the right to bear arms, if people are willing to listen. All these should ring a bell. Right? There was 2 quartering acts leading up to the Revolution, and both of them ticked off the colonies, something fierce. So that's why that's plugged in there. And again, these are kind of squished down just for ease of remembering. I'd never ask you to fill out here, tell me what the Bill of Rights are. It's just good to know. If you're going to search and see something, there has to be a reason behind it. You have to have what's known as a search warrant. You just can't come rolling in and take stuff. A due process, and I plead the 5th, the right to not incriminate yourself in court. Another one, trial by jury. Back to the Sugar and Stamp Acts, the Vice Admiralty courts. No, not just one person loyal to the crown. We're going to have a trial by jury, just like British citizens did. This one's kind of ridiculous at this point. It has to do with how much money common law deals with, so anything over $20 had to go to court. At this point, right, $20 was a lot of money back then. No cruel and unusual punishment. No waterboarding. And then we looked at these already, kind of the catch-alls. If it's not in the Constitution, where does it reside? Just because we didn't cover it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So the people in the states, this division of power. And not to confuse you guys, but that's what's known as federalism, as opposed to Federalist Party. Federalism says there's power at the local, state, and federal level, a division of power. So you don't have an overly powerful central government. Why would the Anti-Federalists want this? You can see where there's limits. It says, hey, even if you have a fairly powerful central government, all of these rights help preclude too much power. So that's why they were pushing for it, and they got it. And then this one, just think about that for a minute. Do the founders list what you can do or what you cannot? To say what you can do would be an enormous task. So yeah, as far as the legislative branch, here's your what you can and can't do. But as far as the people go, if it's not listed, basically you can do it unless what? That harm clause idea. Your freedoms extend up until the point that they can start hurting somebody else. And we discussed that in class, the idea. You want to watch the Super Bowl and have a few beers? Good on you. But don't get behind the wheel of a car, right? Because that can now hurt somebody else. All right, how to amend it? I mentioned it's hard, and we're getting toward the finish line here. It's interesting, but it is a little bit dry. So the Constitution provides ways to amend it. And we've actually had an amendment that said stop drinking, and then a few years later they were like, that's a terrible idea. So the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment. So that can happen as well. Great idea. Well, maybe not so much. 2/3 majority. Okay, so in the Congress, they play a part in this, but then to get it ratified, there's 2 methods. This Constitutional Convention, which has never happened, or the more common one is this, 3/4 of the states. So right now with 50 states, 38 states would have to say, yep, that's a good idea. We're going to amend the Constitution. And notice, this person, the president, has nothing to do with amending the Constitution. It doesn't even go to the White House for a signature. So it goes from the Congress to the states. That's federalism in action, right? A division of power, federal to state. Back to ratifying the Constitution itself, 9 of 13, and we talked about those compromises baked in to make it happen. And so right off the bat, 5 states, bam, we're behind this. Now we got to get 4 more, and that's where these compromises really come in. And I showed you guys this in class. But the founders thought at least enough of us, the unwashed masses, to write a series of newspaper articles that become known as the Federalist Papers. And what they're doing is they're trying to explain to the public, and maybe each other a little bit, why this idea should be in the Constitution. And these are published throughout the country, and people consume them and go, okay, I'm behind this, or maybe I don't like that, but at least I understand why they're trying to put that in the Constitution. So that's what these become known as. All of those articles, mostly Madison and Hamilton. That's actually a typo. I need to fix that. It was John Jay, not Thomas Jefferson, that wrote a few odds and ends. Jefferson wrote a lot about separation of church and state. That's accurate, but he was not part of this Federalist Papers. I'll go back and fix that. Anti-Federalists don't like this. They're mobilizing to defeat the Constitution, even with the Federalist Papers. So what Connally assuages their ideas? The Bill of Rights. So right now, as it stands, the Constitution looks to be in jeopardy, and a lot of time and effort has gone into this. And if it fails, what do we do now? Do we drop back and punt, or do we have 13 individual little countries as opposed to the United States of America? Okay, so the promise of that Bill of Rights, that kind of puts us over the top. Now, the Anti-Federalists go, we believe you, you promise you'll do it, and they kept their word. And so that allows for enough of the states, right? Now we get 4, 5, 6 more. The total's 11 sign off on it, and now it becomes the law of the land. Rhode Island, North Carolina, I was right. Those two finally join in. Again, it was a moot point, so you may as well join the club, unless you want to be your own country. Okay? So that Bill of Rights piece was critical. Had to have it. And I think we're glad it's there now, certainly, this delineation of rights that we have, keeping from having an overly powerful central government. I'm just going to throw these up, and you guys can read through them. I don't want to talk through every one of them. But how things become law, I mean, again, good old Schoolhouse Rock. This is really good. It steps through the process. Right? I'm just a Bill. You may have seen it. And I put a few humorous links. There's a couple other versions out there that are kind of funny. And here's that link to Citizens Against Government Waste that we looked at in Tech Time. If you want to look through all of the powers of the legislative branch, Article 1, Section 8. Right? We just looked at that. But what they can do, they're the law writers. And the checks and balances written into that. Right? When you hear people complaining about taxes, oftentimes, there's a lot of things that get thrown at the president that really aren't his purview. Yes, the budget piece, the president creates here's what I suggest we spend money on, but he doesn't write the annual budget. So if you don't like where money's being spent, it's the Congress that finalizes. They have the power of the purse, as it's known. Naturalization, how to become a citizen, post office, wrongdoings, Army and Navy, they're in control. And now, of course, Air Force, which we didn't have back then, and the power to declare war. And the House, we've been through this a lot, but it's a new, a current event. The House does the investigation and comes up with impeachment charges. Those are sent to the Senate, and the Senate is the trial portion of it, right? And they decide guilty or innocence. And we've got one of those looming. Actually, another one looming. And I mentioned this, the elastic clause, that last one that's kind of the catch-all. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, so use good judgment, folks. Necessary and proper. Sometimes that's misused, but it's been very useful. What can't they do? You can't suspend habeas corpus. You can't make laws that go back in time and say, this used to be legal, now it's illegal, or vice versa. You can't go back and arrest somebody for something that wasn't a law back then. Just because you make a new law today doesn't mean if you did it 3 months ago, you're guilty of that, because it just came into being. Right? No preferential treatment. That comes from the founding of the Northwest Territories, right? Everybody comes in on the same level state-wise. We're not going to play these games. Titles of nobility, right? Lord, whatever. And Washington plays a big piece in that. They wanted to actually call him something a little more lofty. And you know what he said? He said, no, Mr. President is the term. And that's stuck ever since. Washington set all kinds of, the words precedents. He set the tone for the next 250 years. The two terms, it's actually quantified now in the 22nd Amendment. But for the longest time, it was just because Washington set that as a precedent. He served 2 terms. He didn't even want to serve a second term, but everybody followed that up into FDR with 4. Right? And some the powers of the president. We mentioned these internal and external police forces, the FBI, the CIA, they work for the president. And we covered most of these. Let me pause it. My wife's pacing around. That last one I did want to spend a minute on. This is executive orders, executive actions, sort of synonymous. There's a link, that Blue Star link takes you to Wikipedia, actually lists all the presidents and how many executive actions they've taken. And so this is kind of a universalism. Each president does, some do more than others. And so it's not unusual to see President Trump did some, President Biden's done a whole bunch in his first week in office. Some of that to kind of rejoin the world community, the World Health Organization, the Paris Climate Accords, etc. Full force of law, yes and no. There are some exceptions to it. Sometimes it's just more of a policy statement that this is how we're going to do things. One of the first ones I remember President Obama put forth was like a transparency in government, you could call it. And Biden's done the same thing. And it's actually visible in action. They've done a whole bunch of press conferences to tell the press and tell us through the press what's going on. And they put forth one that there will be no conflict of interest. He's not going to hire his sons or his kids or his family into government positions, unlike the previous president that was surrounded by him. So that would be an example of an executive order. Right? These can be a little bit contentious. And I know Congress can get their panties in a wad over it because they're supposed to be the law writers, not the president. But it is a little bit of that, I wouldn't call it balance of power. Maybe it is to allow them to do that as opposed to the Congress just having everything go through the Congress. And then the Supreme Court, this is finishing us up. The Supreme Court's a referee, right? Is a law constitutional? Does it meet the intent of the Constitution? And so that didn't actually exist in the Constitution early on. It wasn't until early 1800s that it was decided they have this idea of judicial review. And it makes sense, right? You come up with some kind of law, especially a bias law. Is that constitutional? And now they're not perfect. Right? There's one, Plessy versus Ferguson, that quantified and said, yes, separate but equal is constitutional. Of course, that gets overturned in the 1950s with Brown versus Board of Education. So they're not perfect, but at least that idea of they're looking at, is this constitutional? Right? Interpret the laws. They're a referee. Okay? 9, again, that's not specified anywhere, but it seems like a good number. We see when we get to FDR, he's getting fed up with not getting some of his New Deal legislation passed, so he tries to do what's called pack the court. He wants to put in 13 or 15 or 17, put more people, what's the word, sympathetic to his New Deal ideas, and that gets squashed. And it actually hurts him in his re-election attempt. It's not fatal, obviously, he gets re-elected, but that's been discussed as well with Biden. That was one of the contentious things in the debate. Are you going to try to pack the court? Why would they do that? Go back to my picture. You've got 6 of the 9 justices now are conservative. And so the idea of trying to rebalance conservative to liberal. My opinion, for what it's worth, is I think judges act objectively. Now, it may influence their decision making a little bit, but I don't know that we have to go into this, let's change the number of justices to rebalance it. Again, it's kind of like the idea of, does Trump want to run? Can he run again in 2024? We'll see, but let's trust the people to decide, yes, we want him back, or no, we don't want any more of this chaos. Trust the people that are in charge, right? And of course, the Supreme Court doesn't get every case that comes up. It's only very few actually that make it to that level, the top court of the land. So a lot of them are done on the lower circuit courts, federal courts, in and around the country. Okay? They get nominated by the executive, approved, legislative. Right? The president nominates, the Senate approves. May be impeached. See, never occurred. I think it was at the federal level. There have been judges removed for malfeasance, but I don't know if any Supreme Court justices have been. And not above controversy. And this just was in my head, but Brown versus Board of Education. Roe v. Wade, that was the decision that legalized abortion. Bush versus Gore decided the 2000 presidential election, and Citizens United, not that old, and that said money equals free speech, and you can contribute all you want to presidential candidates, which has made it more of a buying offices as opposed to voting people into offices. To me, again, my opinion, some of these, Brown versus Board, turned over, Plessy versus Ferguson, good. Roe v. Wade, that's a controversial one. Bush v. Gore was a terrible decision. Citizens United, to me, is the worst. We need to get money out of politics, not promote more money in politics. Again, that's my opinion. All right, let's finish up with this. A little sort of fun, little new idea. Philosophy. Woo. There's this concept of the duality of man. And believe it or not, this does apply to the Constitution. The framers sat and thought about it, that humans have that angel and devil on their shoulder. And Hamilton, in the first Federalist paper, writes about that. Whether societies are really capable of establishing good government using the angel on their shoulder. And so how they kind of come up with this idea, believe it or not, is the Constitution, and as laws come about now, the idea is we should support the good side of humanity, incentivize maybe the good side of humanity, and restrict the devil on our shoulders. Now, we can't say everything, and again, this gets down to interpretation, the idea of legislating morality that we talked about in class. So big ticket items, promote the good, restrict the bad. Holy moly, these guys were smart, weren't they? And Hamilton writes about it. And now there's been newer kind of, I don't know, philosophies of selfishness, if you ask me. Ayn Rand's a big one, and she's kind of a clarion for a lot of Republicans. Now, there's nothing wrong in my mind with being self-sufficient, taking care of yourself, keeping your act together, but that her idea was if we all act very kind of selfishly in our self-interest, it'll all work out in the end. And I don't think so. I mean, humans have that kind of greedy, self-interested bent, the little devil, and some of that should be restricted. Yes, take care of yourself. Yes, you're important, taking care of number one, as we say, but we shouldn't all be out there just trying to grab from other people to make ourselves more wealthy or more powerful. Again, my opinion, but be that as it may. Nice pictures, huh? And of course, we can't do this. So I'm just going to ask you guys to think about it. And maybe at one of the classes, somebody bring this up and we'll discuss it. But is there something right now, an amendment or two, that needs to be put into the Constitution? Or maybe just a state law? Because laws evolve, laws change. And so we use that as kind of a class exercise. Of course, we can't do it. Looky there. A little bit longer than I thought, but some good talk about the Constitution, the pieces of it, the checks and balances, things like that. Right, so that concludes Chapter 7. Let's see, you guys, for Chapter 8, we'll actually do all of Chapter 8 in class, and that'll be February 4th, which is the day the midterm opens. So that'll conclude all the material, either in class or via video, to prepare you for the midterm. Right now, Quiz 3 is still active. I'm doing this Saturday afternoon, so I'll wait. But Quiz 1 and 2 with answers are both posted for review. I wouldn't watch the videos again, but look over the slides, look over the glossary of keywords. And again, for the midterm, I haven't built it, but 45, 50-ish questions, more than a quiz, but you're going to have 2 hours to complete it. And even in class, when I do this as a paper copy, it usually takes folks about 35 to 45 minutes. So you should have double that time. So have those open. It's open book. Use the slides, use the glossary, use your notes, and do the best you can on the midterm. It's worth 15%. It's not going to kill you. It's not going to make your grade, so just do the best you can. Right, enough cheerleading. It's time. My throat's getting dry. Time for some Mountain Dew. I will see you guys in class on Thursday.